Good evening, everybody. Let me welcome you all to our Fall Magi Lecture, Staying Human in the Era of Artificial Intelligence. I'm Jessie Taylor, a physicist at St. Joe's University and the director of the Magi Project. The Magi Project exists at the intersection between science, philosophy, and religion, and works to facilitate dialogue across those disciplines through courses, conferences, public talks like this one, and various other programming. We invite students, faculty, and anyone else who is interested into conversations that explore the fundamental questions of the universe and our own place within it through the distinct but complementary approaches of science, philosophy, and religion. I'd like to thank the Lumen Christi Institute supporting the Magi Project with funding from the John Templeton Institute, as well as our co-sponsors this evening, the Penn Newman Center and the Drexel Newman Center. Tonight, we turn our attention to a very timely topic, staying human in this brave new world of artificial intelligence. And I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Joseph Vukov. Dr. Vukov is an associate professor of philosophy at Loyola University, where he's also associate director of the Hank Center for Catholic Intellectual Heritage. Obtained his PhD from Fordham University. Dr. Vukov teaches and conducts research in the ethics of neuroscience and emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, and in science and religion. He's one of the primary investigators on a National Endowment for the Humanities project, Science for Humans, a program that aims to integrate STEM and humanities instruction in order to equip students to address future problems. Dr. Vukov has authored 3 books, most recently Staying Human in the Era of Artificial Intelligence, and numerous academic journal articles. His writing has also appeared in venues such as Chicago Tribune and American Magazine. He serves on the AI research group for the Dicastery for Culture and Education and is the current president of Philosophers and Jesuit Education. With that, let me turn things over to Dr. Vukov.
Thanks so much for the lovely introduction. Thanks everyone for being out tonight. It's good to see you all. It'd be awkward to give a talk with no one in the room, so I appreciate you coming out. The title of the talk today is Staying Human in an Era of Artificial Intelligence. At this point, I don't have to pitch to you that AI has been a hot topic, that a lot of people have been thinking about the implications of artificial intelligence integration in all sorts of different sectors, in the economy, in politics, in healthcare, in our own personal lives. It also shouldn't be a surprise to people gathered here, maybe it is to some of you, but that the Catholic Church has emerged already as a thought leader in addressing many of these questions. In fact, our new Holy Father, Pope Leo, which I will not tire of telling you is a Chicago guy, you can actually, among Chicago Catholics, it's a challenge to see if you've got the Pope in your phone, if he's Cardinal Bob, the Pope, or Father Bob, or just plain Bob. It depends how long you've known him for. It's very, very strange to have a Pope with an accent to the people that you are living with. The new Holy Father, when he was elected, this is the first address he gave to the College of Cardinals after his election, said this: "I chose to take the name of Leo XIV mainly because Pope Leo XIII addressed the social question in the context of the first great industrial revolution. In our own day, the Church offers to everyone the treasury of her social teachings in response to another industrial revolution and to developments in the field of artificial intelligence." So he basically announced to the Cardinals, I'm going to be the AI Pope. And it isn't just the Holy Father. The Vatican has several projects working on AI right now. Pope Francis had previously commented on AI on several international and major addresses, including the G7 summit. Last year, Antiqua et Nova was published, which is the most definitive document the Church has published so far on artificial intelligence. It's not an encyclical. We're waiting for the encyclical. But there's been one major document come out on this already. So that leads to this question of whether or not all this talk about AI is overblown. Is it overhyped? Is Pope Leo kind of jumping on a bandwagon by saying this is going to be a main focus of my pontificate, or is he really onto something? And I want to suggest to you today that he really is onto something, that it really is a cultural sea change of a kind of technology. But I want to focus on some issues that haven't been focused on quite as much, at least in Catholic circles before. Most of the documents we have so far, and most of what the Holy Father and what Pope Francis said regarding to AI, mostly had to do with economic impact, environmental impact, and other kinds of social and cultural change. At the very end of Antiqua et Nova, though, and this is literally the last paragraph before the concluding paragraphs, The authors bring in another aspect of the way in which AI poses a challenge to us, and specifically the way it poses a challenge to us as humans. Here's what it says. A further point to consider is the call, prompted by the appearance of AI on the world stage, for a renewed appreciation of all that is human, as the rapid pace of digitization risks a digital reductionism. So what they're getting at here is that the era of AI poses really essential challenges to our understanding of ourselves as humans, to our humanity, in the form of this digital reductionism. So a big part of what I want to do with you today is try to unpack what I think is going on in this quote. And here's going to be the plan. I have several theses. The first thesis is this, is that we are, and already have been, living in two different worlds. What I'm going to call the human world and what I'm going to call the post-human world. And I'll say what that means in just a second. But the first part of the talk is that we already are living in these two very different worlds right now. The problem is that we are collectively and rather rapidly losing our grip on the more human parts of our existence. Second thesis. This is, I think, an underappreciated challenge with artificial intelligence. I should say, a lot of my comments today about AI will be critical, but you can see I've tried to put together a flashy PowerPoint to show that I'm actually not a total Luddite. One underappreciated challenge of AI is that it's going to accelerate these trends. What's the upshot? That as we integrate AI more and more into our private and professional and political lives, it's going to be more and more difficult to stay human. And I want to suggest that while this should be concerning for everybody, it should be especially concerning for Catholics. So I'm going to do a little bit of theological work down the road as well. But the good news is that staying human is still a live option for us. So that's where we're going. First of all, some basic work on these terms I want to use. I'm not committed to this being the best use of these terms, human and post-human, but hopefully just to give you a 50,000-foot view of the sorts of cultural trends I'm trying to identify here. The first trend that I want to identify is a move away from what I'd like to talk to you about as human rootedness. It's kind of an abstract term, but I'll try and fill in what I mean by it. By rootedness, I mean our existential ability to simply be who we are and not anything else. When I was growing up, I played in a lot of really bad punk bands in the early 2000s. And the worst thing that you could be called in early 2000 punk bands was a sellout or a poser. It's a little bit different meaning here, but I actually think it's kind of onto something. A human who is rooted is not a poser, is not a sellout. They rather are who they are and nothing else. I work at a Jesuit university, so I need to bring in a Jesuit. Here's one of the greats, Gerard Manley Hopkins. This is from his poem, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, and I think he also is getting at what I'm trying to describe what I mean by human rootedness. Here's Hopkins. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame, as tumbled over rim and roundy wells stones ring, like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being labors, each one dwells, selves, goes back. Myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. There's a lot of things going on here. Part of what's going on, and there's a second stanza that's even better, but not quite as relevant, and I didn't want to do the whole poem today, is that something praises God for Hopkins when it simply is most fully what it is. So stones praise God by being stony, kingfishers praise God by being kingfishery, dragonflies praise God by being dragonfly. The funny thing about humans is we're one of the only things that can be and actively seek to be something other than what we are. And there's a whole lot of different ways that we do this. We could talk about bad faith. There's all sorts of different philosophical lenses by which we can talk in ways in which humans resist our rootedness. The one that I want to talk about today is simulation. I want to suggest to you that one of the defining features of the post-human world is that it's largely a simulated world. It presents us with a version of the world somewhere other than we are, a version of ourselves other than we are, a version of our relationships other than they are. The classic example here, of course, is an avatar in a video game, right, where I'm working my way through a world as an avatar, as something other than what I am. Less dramatically, it also is when, if you're like me, sometimes you're on a Zoom call and have piles of laundry in the background and you decide I'm going to do the blur of my background and maybe even insert a nice mountain vista in the background, right? You're simulating something else. You're showing that Zoom is already a form of simulation because we're simulating this experience, but then you all of a sudden start adding in backgrounds and the simulation is leveled up. The great philosopher of simulation is Jean Baudrillard. I think I'm proud of this slide because I'm guessing it's the first time that Gerard Manley Hopkins and Jean Baudrillard have ever appeared together on a slide. But I think it works because he talks a lot about simulation, and here's what he has to say. Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, when in fact the America surrounding us is no longer real, but of the order of the hyperreal and of simulation. So Baudrillard's point here I think is really interesting, which is all of us kind of obviously would say the whole point of a place like Disneyland or an adventure park, you can kind of name a place like this, is that it's fake. It's simulated. It's trying to make you pretend that you're someplace other than what you are. What Baudrillard is interesting is that he says that distracts us from the fact that a big chunk of 21st century life is just as simulated as Disneyland. So I already gave you the example of the avatar, the simulated Zoom background. If you start looking for how many aspects of our lives are simulated, I think you'll start to be surprised. So just a couple examples. My house sometimes will light a candle, and the candle is often has an aroma that sort of simulates a certain kind of season, right? So you can come home and all of a sudden it smells like pumpkin pie because you've got a pumpkin, oh, it's very fall, and now it's changing to mulled wine. What are we doing there? Again, I should say here too, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with these practices. What I'm saying is that what we're doing is we are, in very small and incremental ways, engaging in practices that take us out of where we really are and try and transport us to something else. We're simulating an experience with even something as similar as candles. Suppose that you go out for dinner in the suburbs somewhere. You have a choice between all sorts of simulated environments. I can go to simulated Tuscany at the Olive Garden or simulated Mexico at Chili's. Same thing happens in the grocery store. Sometimes go through and look at how many things in the grocery store actually just say what the product is. It's usually just the generic stuff. Almost all the non-generic stuff participates in some kind of simulation, right? It's here's the kind of person you want to be. Here's what you could be. Here's the place in which you can imagine yourself being when you're eating this product. So I think once you start to notice simulation, you'll notice just how rampant it is in our culture already. Am I saying again that simulation is intrinsically problematic? No, but what I am suggesting is that simulation is a less human mode of engagement with the world, a less human kind of experience. And in 21st century life, we're often swapping out one for the other, right? My Chicago suburban house smells kind of funky, so I'll cover it up with some simulated smell of Christmas cheer. Not bad, but it's the sort of thing that I think happens more and more in our lives. Second point of contrast is the contrast between embodiment and digitization. Human beings are embodied. It's a crucial part of the Catholic intellectual tradition. The Catechism just says we're human beings are essentially soul and body, but it's an important part of a lot of traditions, both religious and secular, that what I am is this thing right up here. Right? I am a human body. Whereas 21st century culture often swaps out embodied practices for digital substitutes for them. Again, the obvious example here is the way in which social media can swap out personal in embodied relationships. They're still personal, so I think social media can be a good thing sometimes, but you're swapping out embodied relationships for something disembodied. There's also, though, a whole lot of other places where we see this march towards digitization. One way I actually like to think about this is to think about different hobbies and how digitized and disembodied hobbies have become. I'm a guitar player, and over the last 50 years, you can walk the hobby of guitar playing from something very embodied, where everyone was playing acoustic guitars, and now all of a sudden they're electric, and now all of a sudden the tube amps get switched over to fully circuit board driven solid state amps, and now the hotness in guitar playing is amp simulation. And you can take a whole bunch of different hobbies like this and walk them down. Typewriters became word processors, became cloud computing. Cameras became digital cameras, became Instagram. Are any of these changes intrinsically bad? I don't think so. But what are all of them? They're all disembodying. They all swap out more embodied experiences for less embodied experiences. And on the terminology I'm using, human experiences for what I'm calling post-human experiences. Another key feature of the post-human age is personalization. We want our news feeds to be personalized. We want our social media pages to be personalized. We want our fast food orders to be personalized, right? Personalization is the thing that companies aim for. That's the thing that we often want. And I think that a lot of times when we're thinking about personalization, we're thinking about it intuitively in contrast to anonymity, right? You think like, do I want an anonymous burrito? No, I want a personalized burrito. Do I want anonymous New York Times front page? No, I want personalized New York Times front page, and so on down the list. I think, though, that that's a misleading way of thinking. I think sometimes personalization offers us something in contrast to anonymity, but I think all too often it rather swaps out something personalized for something that was formerly shared. I'll give you one example. I've got a good friend named Ryan. Ryan and I both love reading books. Right, so a big part of our friendship is we'll just go for long walks and just talk about books and give each other recommendations. Ryan's recommendations are not as personalized as the recommendations I get from Amazon.com when I pull up an Amazon page. Amazon knows not only every book I've bought, it's known every book I've ever clicked on. And its recommendations are spot on, and I reliably look at the Amazon page and think I do in fact want to read that book. What happens, though, when I switch out those long walks with Ryan and just say, Ryan sometimes misses, right? He sometimes likes this book and it's weird. Like, I don't know why he liked that. I might think, well, I'll just go with Amazon. I'll go with the personalized experience. What happens? I might get something more bespoke to my taste, but I've lost something that was shared. I've lost a friendship in this case. The post-human world is also optimized. We want to get from point A to point B in the most optimal way possible. Our GPSs are the classic example of this. I commute in Chicago traffic at least 3 days a week, and I rely heavily on my GPS, because if you take the wrong road at the wrong time, that's an extra hour of your drive home. But you can take this to an extreme. My favorite story actually comes from my friend Ryan. He's also a college professor, and was telling me about a student of his, and he teaches at a small liberal arts school. This is not in a city, it's not an urban campus. This is a small campus in the middle of the suburbs. There's maybe a dozen buildings, and it's maybe 3 blocks by 3 blocks wide. It's a small school. And Ryan was asking his students, he told them, I want you all to give up your phones for a week. And we're going to read about technology, we're going to read about experience and human experience, and then you're going to write about the experience giving up your phone. Of course, the caveat for anyone who has ever done an assignment like this, you always have to say, let me know if you really need it. Because obviously some people really do need their phones. If their phone is connected to like an insulin pump. It's like, no, please don't give that up. So he has a student that comes up to him and says, Ryan, I don't think I can give up my phone because I don't think without my phone I'd be able to get to class. And Ryan says, oh, do you commute in? And the student says, no. Says, I have never walked to a building on campus. Remember, it's this small suburban campus without following the directions that my phone was giving me. So I have no idea where any of my classes are. I don't know what Ryan said. It sort of proved his point that this kid needed to give up the phone for a little while. What do we lose, though, when we have experiences like those? I think what we lose is we gain this optimization, but we lose, number one, we lose our rootedness. So notice how all these things go together, right? How do we lose our rootedness? It's because optimizations require simulation, right? In order to optimize my route to work, I first have to simulate the geography, and then it's that simulation that I'm following and not the actual move and flow of traffic. What we also lose is a more dynamic interaction with our environments. I was talking to Alex at dinner before, and he said messy is a good word too. I like that word too. Right? We lose the messiness, the dynamicness of human existence, which I think is a real loss. Here's one example of that too, just if the student getting lost on campus isn't good enough for you. Certain parts of the internet world, which I think are targeted in some ways at me, like 40-year-old guys who are kind of starting to fall apart, are very into counting steps and tracking macros. Right? It's like I see some people nodding, and I'm sure there's a reason why like my demographic this shows up. It's like you got to start counting exactly how much protein and exactly how many carbs. For anyone who's tried to attempt this, you know what it does. I get an optimum diet that completely kills all joy. Because all of a sudden, when I'm over at Aunt Sheila's house and she has her famous apple pie, I can't eat Aunt Sheila's, right? I do a calculation, which is already dehumanizing and weird, and then I think, no, I can't have apple pie, Aunt Sheila, it'll throw my macros off for a week. So we lose this dynamism of actually being able to interact with our environments and with each other through optimization. Just a couple more here. I think we also lose leisure. This, I should say, this is a kind of a 50,000-foot talk. I'm throwing a lot of ideas at you guys really quickly. What's leisure? We could do a whole talk on this. I just want to move really quickly because I want to show how some of these things relate together. The great philosopher of leisure is Josef Pieper. You should read his stuff on leisure. It's phenomenal. He's got a lot to say, and again, I'm not going to do him justice right now, but he says this: leisure, it must be remembered, is not a Sunday afternoon idle, but the preserve of freedom, of education, and of culture. Leisure for Pieper, to put it simply, and this is why I've got it categorized how I do, makes us more human. There's a lot more to it than that, but for Pieper, the reason why something like a good canoe ride or reading a good book or a good hike with a friend counts as a leisure activity is that after I've completed that, I feel and in fact am more human. But of course, the post-human is very bad at leisure. What it is good at is entertainment. And we could do a whole talk on the difference between leisure and entertainment. I'll just throw one example out there for you. The difference between a canoe ride and an afternoon scrolling on TikTok. I've never known anyone who scrolled on TikTok for an afternoon and looked up and says, I just feel so much more affirmed in my humanity after that. There's obviously nuance and subtlety here. The idea, though, is that the post-human world capitalizes on entertainment, whereas a more human form of existence is one of leisure. The last point I want to make, just very quickly, is that these lists are not innocent. One thing these have in common, simulation, digitization, personalization, optimization, entertainment, is that they are much more easily monetized than the things falling on the list over here. I'm thinking here a lot about Shoshana Zuboff's work on surveillance capitalism. Again, we could do a whole long talk about Zuboff's work. Her key insight is that the digital age, for the first time, has allowed us to monetize human experience in a way that's never been possible before. It wasn't possible to monetize the experience I have going for a canoe ride. Whereas it is possible to monetize an afternoon on TikTok because you can gather data that shows exactly where I'm clicking and exactly what my habits are. So of course this just makes things worse, is that by monetizing all this, there's sort of this loop in which the monetization encourages us to go more and more into the post-human world and farther away from the human world, which is not meant to be monetized, but is rather meant to be free in several senses. Okay, this in some ways was a preamble, and you might say, Joe, you haven't talked about AI yet, and you're like 28 minutes in. We're getting to it, but it's because I think that I wanted to try and unpack that claim from Antiquae et Nova about AI challenging our humanity by giving you some structure for it. And I think this has been an underappreciated way in which AI poses a challenge for us. Not that it's not important to talk about environmental impact or economic impact or job loss. Those are all crucially important, and the church has been thinking through, and other people have been thinking through that in really good ways. Rather, what I want to talk to you about just a little bit is the way in which AI inevitably accelerates post-human trends that are already on the ground. And I just want to talk you through a few examples. I tried to get this to kind of like Star Wars. I don't know how it's successful. It's kind of Star Wars-ish. AI in the first place is making it possible to digitize experiences that we would have thought just 10 years ago were not capable of being digitized. Throw just two examples up here. You might not be able to see it. The first one says VR Church, which is exactly what it sounds like. And the second one is Alpha School, a school that's AI powered and that claims to allow kids to crush academics in just a 2-hour day. Both of these companies actually, I think, are doing some good things. So we could talk more, if you're familiar with them, we could talk about both of them. What's interesting to me about them is that AI is allowing them to have disembodied approaches to both education and to religious observance. Right? I can go to church now in VR, and I can do my education through AI-powered tools, things that were formerly embodied that are now disembodied and digitized. AI is also accelerating the trend of optimization. So AI in some ways has already been part of the optimization trend since the beginning, but in recent years, since AI gets more powerful, the capacity for optimization becomes more powerful as well. Anyone know what the picture here is of? Yeah? It's a Waymo. Does anyone know what a Waymo is or Riven? Okay, so there's more people who are clued into this than I was. I did not know about Waymo at all, but I recently went to a conference in Phoenix. And it turns out that Waymo is not just like sci-fi future, it is Uber without drivers. And there's only a few cities that have it. So it started off, I mean, you would guess it, right, in the Bay Area. Then it went to Phoenix. I think they just launched in Houston. You should notice there's commonalities in these cities. They're very not variable when it comes to weather. So one thing that they're still working on is apparently like wet, snowy roads. Still doesn't do that good on. But Phoenix, don't have too many wet, snowy roads, so we can make it work there. I took a ride in one, and it was as good as many Uber rides as I've had. It was pretty good. Where are we gonna? I think that we're gonna see Waymo really take off, right? The tech is there. We just have it's an engineering problem at this point to try and figure out how to implement it in cities with more variable weather patterns. When you add these trends together, though, monetization, simulation, along with things like optimization, where do I see this going? Well, I see it going, and in a way you're already getting there closely with some of the navigation apps we use, is where you hop into the Waymo and it says, oh, Joe's getting in. He really likes bookstores and coffee shops. And we had a company that paid us a little bit from a bookstore and coffee shop. I'm not gonna make you go there, but I'm gonna strongly suggest, right? It's only a mile out your current path. You could grab a coffee and pick up a book and it's gonna be great, right? So you get this even more optimized, but in doing so, even less rooted and more simulated approach to existence. The other example, this is me doing a little bit of speculation, but almost every time I think that something is speculative, somebody like will come up to me after a talk and say, it's not speculative, somebody's doing it. Here's my other idea. So this is a Whoop strap. It's sort of like a really good Fitbit or Apple Watch. This is Soylent. If you don't know what Soylent is, so you should look it up. It's really interesting. So it's a whole Reddit community devoted to Soylent. What Soylent is it's a mixture of nutrients that tries to be perfectly calibrated to the nutrients that a human being needs to survive. And it's a big thing, mostly in Silicon Valley, in which you'll talk to these, it's mostly among coders, will say, I have not eaten anything but Soylent in 5 years. And you can go onto Reddit and you can see that people, so you can get the brand name stuff, but people do their own mixtures, right? And they'll say, hey, I've got a new recipe for peanut butter chocolate Soylent, and I've got this, that, and people, your niacin levels are a little off. You need a little bit more. So this is already a thing. Both of these are already things. My prediction here is that you're going to see these two technologies merge, so that at the end of the day, you will look at your Apple Watch and it will tell you, you were kind of lazy today, Joe. A little less Soylent tomorrow. Right? You don't need as much. Or you're a little bit more active today. You maybe need a little bit more. And that your diet itself will become so optimized that forget about Aunt Cheryl's apple pies. You don't even get to have the amount of Soylent that you want because you'd be taking in too many macros if you have that extra little bit of Soylent. I said that some of these predictions come true. I was just giving a talk about a month ago, and this youngster, he was an undergrad, came up to me and says, I'm launching a startup that basically does this. Just a couple more predictive things. Right now, the way that a lot of our digital platforms work when it comes to personalization is that they personalize from a catalog of content. This should not be news to anybody, right? But if you go onto Netflix, there are all the shows, and then the algorithm looks at what shows does Joe like and suggests those shows to me, such that the more you watch Netflix, the more bespoke your recommendations get. And of course, this is how Spotify works, it's how Amazon works, it's how ChatGPT works. Already, that kind of personalization, I don't know if other people have noticed this, but already this has taken lots of culturally shared experiences and severed them. I'm starting to be an old man, but when I talk about these things, but I remember when I was growing up, I mean, you shouldn't trust anyone that leads with that sentence, but when I was growing up, everyone didn't have the same tastes, but we kind of knew all the same things. So like everyone knew who Nirvana was. Not everyone listened to Nirvana, but everyone was like, yeah, they're sort of like, they're one of the bands. You don't get that anymore today, right? If you pull up somebody else's Netflix, it just looks totally bizarre. And you say like, I had no idea that was even a show, and you're like 7 seasons in. So already we have ripped apart a lot of shared experiences with the capacity to personalization that we have already. My prediction here, and again, we're already seeing this, that it's happening, is that AI is going to allow us to move from a model in which we're curating content using AI and instead creating content using AI. So that when I log into ChatGPT, which is this already, we're already there more or less, that it's not ChatGPT, it's JoeGPT. Instead of Netflix, Spotify, it's Joeify. It doesn't quite work. And instead of Netflix, it's JoeFlix. Right? So just to make clear what I'm getting at, the idea is that as AI capacity increases, my prediction is that when I go onto Netflix, it just looks at my weird idiosyncratic preferences and says, this guy really likes World War II documentaries and also sci-fi. Kind of weird, but we're going to do the mashup like documentary style World War II, but there's like aliens too, right? And then all of us said it'll have that capability, which of course would be very tempting to watch and also would be hugely alienating because all of a sudden we literally, it's not that I just don't watch the same stuff on Netflix, it's entirely different platforms for both of us. And this is getting better and better. I don't know if anyone's seen sort of how good the video and music is getting, but it's getting really, really good. I actually don't think we're that far off from having something like this. And then the last one, of course, sort of the thing that powers all this is that as AI makes all those things more possible, the capacity for monetization also becomes greater. Think about when I'm watching that World War II sci-fi flick that's created just for me, the power of a product placement that isn't just a random product placement, but is actually the thing that I was shopping for on Amazon last week. So monetization becomes all that much more powerful as well. What's the result of all this? The result, I think, and this is this, again, I'm sort of coming back to that Antiqua et Nova quote, that one thing we need to be concerned about is the loss of our humanity and challenges to who we are as humans. I worry that we've already reached a point where we're starting to lose our grip. And what do we mean by losing our grip? That we're starting to mistake the post-human modes of existence for the genuine ones and the human modes of existence for the less genuine ones. It's an abstract way of putting it. Here's one example. There was a young woman once who I was talking through some of this stuff, and she raised her hand and says, I think I know what you're talking about. She said, I've got an Apple Watch and I'm a jogger. And I was going to go out for a jog the other day, and I realized my watch wasn't charged. And I told myself, I can't go out for the jog because it's not going to count. I take it a lot of us have had this experience, right? And it's exactly the right thing that I wanted to talk about here. What happened to her? She had inverted her understanding. And what's great is that she still realized this, right? So she still realized, like, no, like jogging is the human thing. The step counter is the thing that helps me simulate and maybe help me keep track and optimize my jogging. But the jogging's the human thing, and the other stuff is there to help. She had psychologically already flipped that, where it was the simulation is the real thing, and the jogging is just the way I get to the simulation. One other story about this. I do a little bit of teaching in VR. I actually kind of like some of the tech stuff. And I had a student tell me after some VR class sessions that he felt more comfortable in virtual reality than in real life in a classroom. I think it's another one of these examples of, that the VR was supposed to be the simulation. It was supposed to be the thing that wasn't real, but it's flipped around, where now it's become more real. The thing that this reminds me of is in C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce. That's what this image is drawn from. There's Dante's Divine Comedy. That's probably got to be the best. But after Dante's Divine Comedy, it's one of the best pictures of heaven and hell that I've ever read. So I highly recommend it. It's hugely funny too. The premise of The Great Divorce is that all these people in hell get to take the heaven bus and go check out heaven for a day. It's not even really heaven. They kind of get to go up to, they kind of go from like hellish purgatory to heavenly purgatory is more what is going on. But roughly they take the heaven bus and they get to go up, experience it for a day. And when they get there, what happens is they go and they see these beautiful pastures and it looks like heaven, but they go to start walking on them and they realize the grass is so real that it feels like knives at their feet. Because they're so unreal, they don't have the substance to crush the grass. So they're all in this excruciating pain to make contact with heaven because they need to become more real. They need to have more grace in them in order for them to take the reality of heaven. And I think this student of mine who says that VR is more comfortable than actually having in-person class sessions is kind of like those people. But in this case, it's not heaven has become too real. It's that reality has become too real. And that we become so comfortable with simulated spaces that when we have contact with the real ones, it's like knives sticking into our feet. I told you I would give you a little theology, or explicit theology here too. I think for anyone this should be concerning, that there are these human and post-human modes of existence, that the post-human ones are gaining ascendancy and that AI is accelerating those changes. From a Catholic perspective, though, I think it's particularly problematic and particularly concerning. Because for Catholics, and I think this is true for other people, but I think for Catholics specifically in one way, the sacraments come to us in our humanity. They come to us in embodied ways, in shared ways. We take the Eucharist, we go to confession. This is actually, you might remember during COVID, there was a debate about whether priests could administer confession, sacrament of reconciliation, over Zoom, right? Father Jose is willing to jump on Zoom and haven't gotten to confession for a while, and it's COVID, so I really need some confession, and can this work? It went all the way to the Vatican. You might not have heard this, but it went all the way to the Vatican. They said, nope, not going to work. Why? Because of this. Because in the Catholic imagination, human modes of existence are actually not sort of unimportant. They're the essential part of how God communicates with us through his sacraments and through his church. Again, I think that the sacraments provide a particularly poignant case of this for Catholics, but I take it for lots of other religious traditions too. There's going to be something like this as well, that we meet God in our humanity, so that the more we aren't human and the more we're living in post-human ways of engaging the world, the tougher it is going to be to engage with those realities. I don't think you can draw a causal line, and I'd be really interested to hear people's thoughts about this, but I really suspect that the more post-human modes of life we find ourselves living, the more bizarre something like the Eucharist is going to look like. Right? The sacraments take us deeper into reality. So if we've removed ourselves from human realities, I think that you're sort of like skipping a whole step, and it looks even stranger than it would if you were starting out as just a human in human reality. So when it comes to AI, at least when it comes to the dehumanizing aspects of AI, I'm not as worried about things like the Terminator coming to get us, nor am I hugely worried about AGI, or artificial general intelligence. Somebody could convince me otherwise, but that's not the thing that keeps me up at night. The thing that keeps me up at night is actually, I've got 4 small children. They keep me up at night. If I manage to get any sleep. The other thing that keeps me up at night is this. It's imagining a world in which the post-human modes of engaging with the world have become ascendant, in which I never take a book recommendation from Ryan, but always just take the easy way and go to Amazon. It's a world in which all my personal correspondence gets run through something like ChatGPT. You might not be able to read this. I can barely read this. Might be time for readers. Can you write a thank you note to Grandma? She gave me $20 for my birthday. I love her a ton. Can you make that clear? What's sad is that, for me at least, I'm not a particularly good thank you note writer. That very well might give me a better thank you note to my mom than one that I would write. I would have it do it and be like, man, that's good. I would not have thought of putting it that way. Give us a better thank you note. I mean, this is one of the tricks here, is that a lot of times what's on offer is something that in one sense is much better than what we had before. The problem is that, and what I've been trying to suggest to you today, is that it's less human than what we had before. And again, that we become so reliant on our navigation apps that we're completely unrooted from our environments. It's not just that student that couldn't find her way to class. How many of you don't have to show your hands. This will be a rhetorical question. How many of us have had the experience where you say, I've been to Greg's house 20 times and I literally have no idea where Greg lives? I see some hands. Yeah, good, right? So it's not just me, right? We're so reliant on those things that we realize I don't know my geography at all anymore. I just follow the thing and I get there. T.S. Eliot, in his early poetry, has this great poem called The Hollow Men. And The Hollow Men ends with these lines. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. I think a lot of the scholarship and talk, including talk in Catholic circles, has focused primarily on the bangs: environmental impact, economic impact, job loss, industry reorganization. Those are super important. I don't want to disqualify or discount the bangs at all. We need to be talking about the bangs. What I wanted to suggest to you today is that we also need to be thinking about the whimpers. The way in which we're not doing something wrong, particularly when I follow a GPS to Greg's house, or when I decide to put on the Zoom background because there's 5 mountains of laundry behind me and I don't want to subject my colleagues to that. What we do is with each of those things, we take just a little further step into post-human ways of living and a little few steps into a less human mode of living. And again, that's really what I wanted to unpack for you today, is that quote we started out with, that this is something that we need to be paying attention to as well, the way in which our humanity gets swapped out for this digital reductionism, as Antiqua et Nova said. So where does this leave us? I think it really leaves us right now at a watershed moment. I shared a couple of vignettes. The young woman who didn't think she should go for a jog because it wasn't going to count because her phone wasn't charged. The person in my class who thought that VR experiences were more real than actual in the flesh experiences. Those are maybe extreme, but I take it a lot of us have places in our lives that are kind of like this, where we're starting to see post-human modes of engaging reality as taking priority over more human ones. So I think we're at a watershed moment. Is the choice before us one of rejecting technology altogether? Probably not. And again, my counterpoint here is I made you a flashy, or at least I thought it looked nice, PowerPoint. Technology can be good. This has been consistently what the church has taught about AI, modern technology generally as well, is that there's a great capacity for good from technology. So I don't think rejecting tech is quite the right answer. Yet at the same time, I don't think we're at a point now where we can assume that we'll just preserve our humanity as we march forward lockstep into an AI-fueled future. I think we need to be more intentional and more discerning about where we're inviting new technologies into our lives. This is for sure the case when it comes to ethically problematic adoptions of technologies, the bangs, but I think it's maybe just as important when it comes to more subtle ways in which technology has an effect on us, the whimpers. I'm thinking about this. This is the title I'm working with. You can tell me if it's any good or not, but as the Bartleby option. Right? So those of you who know Melville's, Bartleby the Scrivener, know that he upends social systems by continually asserting, I would prefer not to. Right? So it's not that here's this intrinsic moral evil, it's just rather I would prefer not to. And I think that one thing we are all individually and socially going to need to start thinking about is where it's going to be important for us to take the Bartleby option. Not saying, again, there's something wrong with using Google Maps, but where am I going to say, I'm going to Greg's house, I got to figure out how to get there. I would prefer not to. I think we need to take the Bartleby option more, and I think that when we do it, it's going to come with real costs. I'll just give you a few examples. My employer, and I think this is probably something pretty standard across employers, I can get a reduction in my health insurance every month if I demonstrate that I'm living healthily. Right? One of the easiest ways to do that is to submit records from a step counter. Right? There's other ways too. I could get the insurance reduction other ways, but one of the easiest ways is how many steps did you take, how many miles did you run, stuff like that. You submit that and you get $50 a month knocked off your health insurance. If I take the Bartleby option and say, I don't want to wear a Fitbit because I'm worried about the ways in which it's going to make me understand my own experience as simulated rather than as rooted, there's a very real cost, and the cost is $50 a month of my health insurance. Self-driving cars, so we talked about Waymo, are more or less already to the point where they're probably going to be safer than human drivers in the very near future. Fast forward 20 years, say that I really just want to keep driving my F-150. I would not be surprised if there will be a pretty big insurance premium uptick for being more public danger for doing that, right? Where you say, no, I preferred actually driving myself places. Maybe the F-150 is about it. Maybe it's your Prius, right? I prefer driving myself instead of taking a Waymo. That might come with a real cost, and the cost of insurance policies. Likewise, if I take the Bartleby option for social media, this is already the case, it's just going to make you take a hit professionally. If you decide, I don't want to be scrolling social media all the time, that will have an effect on your professional life. If you think, what do I want to educate my kids without screens, what kind of cost will that be? Am I going to have to find some alternative or costly way to educate them? Or what if it's nothing even so much as like actual cost, so much as just sticking out? What if I choose to whittle instead of be on TikTok? What if I choose to read Russian novels instead of have a side hustle? It's kind of weird. I think it's good, I think it's human, but that might be one of the costs, is that we make these decisions, we take the Bartleby option, and we just end up looking a little strange. We started with a Leo. I want to also end with a Leo. In this case, Leo the 13th. So everyone knows Leo the 13th as the Rerum Novarum. If you know Leo the 13th, you know him as the Rerum Novarum Pope. Right? So he's the one who wrote Rerum Novarum at the height of the Industrial Revolution and ushered in Catholic social teaching as we know it. What I think sometimes people forget is that Leo the 13th also wrote more encyclicals on the Most Holy Rosary than any other pope in history. He also, if anyone's ever heard the history of the St. Michael prayer, it's a little bit, from what I understand, it's not quite certain if this is like just a story or if it's kind of apocryphal, but the story goes is that Leo the 13th was saying Mass and has something like a seizure that leads to this vision in which he sees God and the devil bargaining over the world, and God basically tells the devil, you can have 100 years to do whatever you want. Right, and it's kind of this is the beginning of the 20th century. It's kind of actually an interesting story. And Leo the 13th is so horrified by this that he goes and writes the St. Michael prayer, which then becomes said in Mass for a long time. And many of you might still, if you attend Mass, my parish is not said in weekend Masses, but daily Masses, we still say the St. Michael prayer at the end of every Mass. That's the story of that. It's from Leo the 13th. What I want to suggest to you with this is that I don't think those two facets of Leo the 13th are unrelated. So I think what Leo the 13th saw was that in a period of great social upheaval and change, do we need the best possible thinking about culture, about economics, about society? Yes, we do, and here's Catholic social teaching. But we also need to realize that these changes are human, they're spiritual, they have to do with our relationship to the divine, and that devotional practices, again, I think it was like 12 encyclicals on the Rosary. That's a lot of encyclicals on the Rosary. And that those kind of devotional practices are also going to be really important in meeting those times of great social upheaval. So that's where I hope we go as Catholic scholars working in AI. Hope that we figure out good ways of applying the best cultural theory, the best social theory of the day, the best economic theory of the day to help us meet the challenges that are coming at us. But I think we also need to honestly reckon with the spiritual dimension of the challenges we're facing in the manner of Leo the 13th. I think we need to do both of those things if we're going to stay human. Thank you.